Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 93rd episode of the Online Tennis Podcast. Today, I'm joined by John Silk to talk French Open draw. John, how you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm not got French Open fatigue yet. We've been a bit concerned with all these sort of 2-week-long Masters and WTA events that it might be the case, but I'm okay. Let's see how we are as we enter the grass court season, though, in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, of course. At the moment, though, I'm fresh and raring to go, John. I would say a little week layover between Rome and the French Open, so I'm all good to go. Today, the men's side of the draw is what we're talking about. We'll talk about the women's in the next episode, but for now, all men's stuff. We're going to fly through just big stories, basically. A few of the guys you should be looking out for that are in danger, a dark horse or two, and then our pick for the champion, John, which I assume you've got one, right? At the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I have got one, but I think we're all in this world capable of plucking one. But I've got one.
Okay, that kind of says to me, John, you might be thinking the same thing as me as well. And I sense that it's quite an open draw today. You're kind of plucking one. It's not necessarily Rafa Nadal's 100% winning the French Open. Certainly isn't this year, obviously.
No.
But yeah, it's pretty open. It's pretty open this year. Yeah. First big stories, though, John, maybe you'll agree with this. A few just literally qualifying very quickly. A very quick, just straight look there. Luca Pouille made it through. It was quite a big story. Obviously, former semi-finalist in Australia and stuff. That was quite big for him to get through. No Liam Brody in terms of the Brits. He lost to Emilio Nava. And Fabian Marotzan even lost to former junior number one Young Chen Shang. So no danger for Alcaraz there either. Obviously, Marotzan, the man that beat Alcaraz in Rome. Have you got any other stories from qualifying, John? Have I missed anything?
I mean, just to elaborate on what you said, it's a very bad qualifying event for the Brits all round, both on the men's and the women's side. Liam Brody's match was nuts. It was just full of this sort of series of games in a row for one player or the other. And ultimately, Brody ended up the worst off of the two. On the men's side, listen, yes, I mean, this leads us into the draw, actually. There is a particular interesting narrative in that we don't yet know, at least at the time of recording, where one or two of these qualifiers will end up landing. And I would argue that that could end up being the story of the draw, as in Aslan Karatsev in particular could play. I think that both Daniil Medvedev and Carlos Alcaraz are awaiting a qualifier. Medvedev, you don't know. I don't know. I wouldn't fancy playing Karatsev, if Karatsev has just had 3 matches already. I think Djokovic may have been, like, if I was a fan of Djokovic's, I probably wouldn't be fancying Karatsev in the first round.
But let's really dive into it. Let's get the draw up. Looks like we're at the top half first, right? The biggest story probably within the draw is that Alcaraz and Djokovic are on the same half of the draw. Is that maybe your take?
It is. It was something I was waiting for before. It's one of those sort of things you think, okay, what can we prepare for the draw? As in, like, we can see this is what we need to look out for very quickly. And I think that was something we were looking out for, which on the face of it, you think, that might be tricky for those two players, in that they've probably got 2 potential winners. When we talk about potential winners, I think many of us are looking at a group of between 3 and 5. And you might get lucky, as in, like, I think Casper Ruud last year, for example, didn't have to play a potential winner really on our cards anyway until the final. And you might hope for that kind of draw. As it is, both of those players will play 2 potential winners, because if they play one or the other in the semi-final and then obviously the final, I mean, a lot to be played before then. Both players, I think their chances of reaching the semi-final have been enhanced as a result of the draw. But possibly winning the tournament just slightly receded because of that fact they're on the same half. So it probably balances itself out, if that makes sense.
You touched on Djokovic there. We can start with fleshing out Djokovic's draw in particular. Obviously, Djokovic coming into this not anywhere near as prepared as he has been in other French Opens in the past. Normally, but at this point, his forehand's rearing, right? And he's not normally got many issues being offensive in that wing. We saw in Rome that was definitely still an issue. And whether that's to do with his elbow, we're not 100% sure. We would normally expect Novak to come into any slam as well prepared as he could be, though. That is the bottom line, right? Regardless of how much experience he's had, how much warm-up he's had prior to this tournament, I would expect him to be all guns blazing. We will see, though, there are a couple of pretty difficult first rounds, or first few rounds for him to get through. Kovacevic, I'm not too bothered by. Fucsovic in the second round, 4-love against Fucsovic, but 3 of those meetings, the Hungarian's taken a set. It's not a good matchup necessarily. Really, really difficult backhand defense from Fucsovic makes it hard for Djokovic to do stuff when his forehand isn't all guns blazing. So if we still see Djokovic a little bit cold, that could be a pretty difficult second round. Then moving on to the third round, of course, Davidovich-Fokina, he speaks for himself on clay. He beat Djokovic in Monte Carlo when Djokovic's forehand wasn't working. This could be exactly the same issue. Again, if Djokovic isn't in full flow, that could be really difficult. And you talked about Bautista Agut, who's taken 3 wins off of Djokovic in the past. They've had a couple of French Open meetings in the past. They were 2 very tight 4-setters. If Djokovic is full flow at that point, it's the Spaniard's lesser preferred surface. I think he'll be okay. If he gets through the first 3 rounds, Djokovic for the semis for sure. I would say Rublev, Kachanov, not as much of an issue in the quarterfinals.
And I think maybe Davidovich-Fokina would be actually the one. I know this history with RBA, but as you say, RBA on clay is maybe not as potent as elsewhere. Yeah, I mean, I remember RBA and Djokovic actually saw them play each other at Wimbledon a few years ago, and I think that went 4 sets, but you sort of always had the classic Djokovic encounter, really, where you just always felt it would go his way. I think Davidovich-Fokina is the one, but the thing is, with a lot of these other players, including especially Davidovich-Fokina, you just don't really know. I mean, Artefis, I think, is a tricky one for him in the first round. Yes. You just don't know where or what might happen before, middle of next week when the third round comes along, or end of next week.
Yeah, absolutely. And you saying that Yibing Wu even for Bautista Agut in the first round, not exactly a given there. Juan Pablo Varillas, somebody who can outpower you on the day. Yeah, there's a lot of banana skins there, which is also why I feel pretty confident about Djokovic at the same time. He might not have to play all those players. He's got a chance to warm into the tournament. Let's see. Moving on to Alcaraz's half. I think people would like this to be fleshed out a little bit. Qualifier or lucky loser, as you say, in the first round. O'Connell, Daniel, both players that he should be able to overpower. Shapo in the third, he's not a threat at the moment. Shapo is really, really out of sorts. There's no guarantee he gets to the third, whatever. Musetti in the fourth, if he gets through Norrie, now that's not a given either, but Musetti in Hamburg, when he played Alcaraz, had a proper game plan to play Alcaraz. He was really good at returning the serve deep with tons of spin. One of the few players that can just completely counter that kick serve from Alcaraz. He could be an issue, for sure. And then we've also got, moving on past Musetti if he gets that far, Tsitsipas in the quarterfinals, which will be an interesting one, obviously.
Musetti's the one. But that's one player. I mean, how many players are we looking at? 32 players right now?
Yeah.
So there are 30 players on that screen, including Stefanos Tsitsipas, at least the Stefanos Tsitsipas we've seen in recent months. There are 30 players on that screen that I think Alcaraz would be 8 times out of 10, 9 times out of 10. The 5-set factor, French Open, does add it. We've seen how just incredibly consistent he can be over 3 sets. I know he's won a Grand Slam before, but his Roland Garros record is not stunning, but it's 2 years, so it's not a huge sample size. But I have to say that generally going into pretty much any of those matches, including Cam Norrie, who I know he lost to earlier this year, but we know the sort of, circumstances around that match in terms of Alcaraz could barely move, I think, in the third set and was just going for winners left, right and center. And still, I think it went 7-5 in Rio, I think it was, wasn't it? I mean, what's his record against Tsitsipas at the moment? It's about 4-0, something like that.
4-0, I think, yeah. What I wanted to kind of point out, though, is that because it's a little bit of a slower tournament, a slower clay tournament, although he's got a good record on clay, he's not got the best record on what we would call slower clay, I guess. He's won in Madrid twice. He's lost at the French Open before the semi-finals every time he's gone there. Same in Rome, the one time he was there, obviously, against Morozan. He doesn't do as well on a slower surface. He can get found out. So I still think it's going to be a big struggle. I think he gets through. But if he got to the semis against Novak...
Well, we'll get to that very
soon. Yeah. I'm jumping the gun a little bit, obviously, John.
But the Tsitsipas thing is something I just want to add to, is that I just think the gap between them in Barcelona was quite scary from that Tsitsipas perspective. And I think Tsitsipas, in his on-the-court speech, he said, "Take it easy, amigo." But in his press conference afterwards, I think he was kind of dumbstruck because he just didn't really know what the solution is or was or potentially could be if they play each other in Paris.
Looking at the bottom half of the draw now, I think it's fair to say in this quarter, Rune would probably be the man to watch rather than Ruud, right? And we can get into that in a second. I would like to just go through Rune's draw a bit because I think a lot of people will have Rune maybe as the eventual champion, certainly one of the faves. He's against Eubanks in the first round, which I would say is a very comfortable first round for him, something to just get him settled. Eubanks is not a clay courter. He's a big server. He's got a one-handed backhand return. That is not a good matchup for Eubanks. So that's a good first round for Rune. Then Baez, obviously Baez can be tough on his day, but he's just a little out of sorts. Kecmanovic in the third is a guy who can be overpowered despite the fact he's a solid opponent. Fritz Cerundolo, then it gets a bit tougher. Definitely Cerundolo is actually, he's hitting peaks that people maybe will underrate a little bit. He could be dangerous for sure. And then after that, you have got Ruud in the quarters. Overall, John, I think that's a pretty good draw.
Not bad. I wouldn't, I think there's better draws. It's that Baez match in the second round, if it materializes. I think most people would expect Baez to beat Monfils. That is one of those that you're sort of just flicking through the channels at 5 p.m. on Wednesday of next week, and suddenly it's like, oh, Holger Rune is down 2-1, and you're just going, well, that's something I've got to tune in for, and can he get it back? And if he was to get in that kind of dogfight, whether it be against Baez or somebody even in round 3 or 4, that's when we're sort of in a little bit of known but also unknown territory with Holger Rune. We've seen Carlos Alcaraz in scraps and dogfights, and I'm actually not thinking about the Sinner match because that was at US Open last year because that was just an insane level. I'm thinking about the round before. Was it Cilic? I think he went 5 sets. We've seen Alcaraz go through these endurance tests, if you like, over 5 sets on different surfaces. Whereas Holger Rune, I think it's a legitimate point to make about him over 3 sets. We've seen him struggle in Monte Carlo recently, for example, towards the end of the final. So that is something, that is maybe the biggest asterisk next to Holger Rune's name between him getting to the final in this tournament. If we look at pros and cons, can Holger Rune reach the French Open final? Absolutely. I think that we don't even need to go into too many details there. Why can't he, or why won't he? The most likely reason is that he gets stuck somewhere in third gear trying to go up a very steep Parisian hill.
That's a very good point. And not even just Monte Carlo, the Munich final that he did eventually win, but that wasn't down to him. The Rome final, we have seen physical issues with him. Very good point, John. It's not a given that he gets through.
Rublev, Australia, wasn't really fatigue, but I think there was some mental fatigue in that 5th set as well.
Yeah, very good point. I'd like to point out a little dark horse in this quarter while we're here. And obviously, Ruud is not a guy I think is going to get far for sure. This is one of the reasons why. I don't think Struff's run to the Madrid final was a fluke. If he's done well at the French Open before, he's been to the 4th round 2 out of the last 3 times he's been there. Tommy Paul, one of his potential 3rd rounds, is not a guy who's proved himself on clay yet. Lehechka's obviously a tough first round, but he gets through that. Who knows? He could beat Ruud. And also, just for Ruud's reference, he's got Van de Zandschulp, he's got Struff, he's got Jarry. All 3 of these players have beaten him this season. All 3, including Jarry, who just beat him in Geneva like yesterday. It's going to be very tough for Ruud. Struff is the guy that could take advantage for me.
Yeah, so there's reasons for optimism and there's reasons to be concerned. I think generally the draw is quite balanced. I mean, there was a danger of having Alcaraz and Djokovic on the same half and seeing that stacked. Didn't turn out that way. We saw those 2 fall, but then we saw things looking a little bit better. On the other side of the draw, as a result, we've got Holger and Medvedev, but there's a bit more of a balance there. There's a few sticky ones ranked between sort of 10 and 20. Yeah, Kecmanovic, all guns blazing could be tricky. Baez is 2. So it's just sort of fairly balanced that you could be worse, could be better from Holger's point of view.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. He's not a guarantee, but could be worse for sure. Let's move to the very bottom quarter of the draw quickly, and then we'll go on to eventual champion picks. Medvedev, of course, now in contention after Rome. Who could deny that? He's definitely changed up some of his game. We talked about it in the last pod. Bigger forehand in general, better movement. He is a threat for sure. And generally, Medvedev's draw is good. I would say out of the 4 that we've mentioned, Medvedev has probably got the best draw, depending on who that qualifier lucky loser is, I guess. But then after that, Hallis, who is not a clay court, in fact, he could get beat by Pea. Nishioka is not a good matchup against Medvedev. That lefty forehand does not work against Medvedev's backhand. Dimonor Choric, tough-ish 4th round, but generally, I don't think Choric is a guarantee to get there. And Dimonor on clay against Medvedev, not the best. It's normally a good matchup when the conditions are pretty slow, but on clay, I'm just not sure. I think Medvedev's got a pretty decent route.
Yeah, when you mention those names, they are slightly different to the previous 3 sort of sections that we looked at. I think they are just slightly a tier below most of the players we mentioned before. So yeah, I would agree. It does depend though on who that qualifier is. But apart from that, yeah, I agree. Pretty nice draw.
Yeah, definitely. And then Sinner, I didn't look too much into Sinner. I expect him to get to the quarters, to be honest. I think everybody there isn't much of a threat. Rusevori plays a very similar game to Sinner. Probably not going to happen. Andrea Hussler as well probably gets beat by Altmaier, who would get beat by Sinner. And then Dimitrov, I guess. You never know with Dimitrov. But apart from that, I think he beats Zverev. I think he beats Tiafoe. I think he gets to the quarters, and then it's pretty tough. John, what do you think?
I agree, although I do think, again, we're probably going, if I said Medvedev's is a tier below, with the names that we highlighted in each section, I think Sinner's is back up to that sort of, could be worse, could be better scenario. Is Zverev in his section, so it'd be potentially a third or fourth round?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if the Zverev of 2022 or 2021 is in Paris, then that's extremely difficult, but we haven't quite seen that level from him, particularly since he got injured last summer. That's coming up to a year anniversary, so he'll be desperate to sort of get closer to that level. There's 1 or 2, as you say, Rusevori is kind of a Sinner light. Tiafoe falls for him, right?
And that's a 4th round, though, yeah.
Yeah, so that's also a 4th round, yeah. So, yeah. Sinner as well is one of these ones, a little bit like Rune, but maybe even more doubt. It's just how much do you trust them in a way to negotiate these rounds 2, 3, and 4, if you like.
Historically, he's been more reliable. To be fair to Sinner, he's been to the quarters of every slam so far. Yeah. He's been getting beaten by good players every single slam he's played. I think that's been Tsitsipas, Alcaraz, Djokovic, and then it must have been somebody good last year. But already that's 3 of the either eventual champions or finalists of the last 3 slams. So that's it's a huge deal. He should do well, given his history, and he's been a threat on this surface for sure for the last few months. So
I'm thinking of a couple of tournaments this year. Maybe I'm just trying to think of one at least. Yeah, I mean in Rome recently, where I expected him to do better.
Cerundolo loss.
Yeah. So, but you're right. I mean, listen, I think Jannik Sinner's incremental improvements over the last 2 years has probably gone under the radar because we've seen sensational improvements from players such as Holger Rune and Carlos Alcaraz. But actually, I do think year on year he has got a little bit better, which is really all you can ask for. And as a result, could he get to the French Open final? Yeah, I guess. But I don't think his peaks this year has been as high as Holger Rune's or even Daniil Medvedev for that matter.
With that said, let's put our money where our mouths are and call who we think is winning the French Open this year. Do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'm going Carlos Alcaraz.
Okay.
But that is said with a little bit less confidence than it was in Rome or just before Rome began. One or two of the things you highlighted on in terms of the differences between the clay court tournaments that we have. I do think the spectre of Novak Djokovic will grow with every comfortable victory that he has. I say that because if he does get in some 4 and 5 setters, that might add a few more doubts to Novak in a way, or to our viewpoint. That can go the other way, of course. I remember last year Novak breezed through the draw to the quarterfinals and Rafa struggled against Felix, and we're thinking, oh, okay. But actually it ended up being the other way around, and maybe that even helped Rafa in that match. But generally I'm going Alcaraz. But let me give an outward take as well. I think that you could probably go a 1 in 3 chance for Carlos, a 1 in 3 chance for Novak, if you like, 30 to 35% for each. And then it's 30 to 35% the field. I posted on Twitter a poll, and I included, because you got 4 choices, and I put Holger Rune as a 3rd choice and 4th as other. And somebody said, probably you should have done Alcaraz, Djokovic, other. And I thought about it. I thought, yeah, actually, in terms of balance, I was just teased and tempted by having the 4 options and wanted to use all 4. But actually, to get probably a more balanced look. And I thought, yeah, that's true, because I actually think there's a 30 to 35% chance that Carlos wins. Same for Novak, and then same for the field. I think it's really tricky to choose who your 3rd favorite would be, or 4th favorite and 5th favorite and so on. But for me, the 2 favorites clearly are Carlos and Novak. And I'm just going to go for Carlos, despite those surface differences or climate differences or environmental differences between them. I just think that his clay court form has been the best all year, really, including the Latin American swing we had in February.
That's fair. That's fair. I like everything you've said there. But I'm going Novak. And by a whisker. It's not as confident as previous slams for sure, just given the clay court form that Djokovic has brought into the tournament. But there have been, for the last 5 years, like 0 instances of Djokovic entering a slam without some sort of decent form under his belt. Not form, sorry, but a decent level. Like, he has always come into the tournament ready. If he's playing the French Open, I trust him at this stage in his career to be ready. I think he'll have done the work he needs to do. If it's an actual injury, it's a different story, obviously. But if it's something that's manageable, I trust Djokovic too much. I think he gets it by a whisker. But then 2nd tier, on the same level for me, is Alcaraz Medvedev. Because I think Medvedev's got a nice draw. And I think that'll make a big difference. I don't think Rome was a fluke. He was repeatedly winning matches, deservedly, because he has made improvements to his game. It's not just a coincidence and just form that's taken him there. A confident Medvedev is a brilliant Medvedev. Because Alcaraz is on the same half of the draw as Djokovic, and with Medvedev playing like that, they're a bit level for me. And then Rune's physical issues put him down 1 peg.
I think I took you a little by surprise last Sunday before that final, where I made Holger Rune a warm favourite. I think you saw it as being a lot closer than that. Of course, ended up being very much to the right call in a way, because Medvedev won. I think it'll be interesting that if Novak has to go through back-to-back Carlos Alcaraz and Medvedev, or Carlos Alcaraz and Rune, that's a difficult comment. There's a lot of tennis to be played before then. But we saw how Rafa got through that quarterfinal last year against Novak, came through the Zverev one, and then had Casper Ruud in the final. If Rafa had got, an on-fire Tsitsipas, or had Zverev on the other side of the draw, or various other possibilities, maybe even a Holger Rune, finding his feet a few months before he finally did in Paris-Bercy, maybe that final might have been one step too much, or certainly would have been a lot more challenging than Casper Ruud turned up. So that's an interesting one. But then we have seen Novak back-to-back in 2021. Probably the best set of all time, arguably, him and Rafa played, and that epic 4-set match that they had. And then he goes 2 sets down to Tsitsipas in the final and still turns it around. So I think it's only the draw that puts Medvedev in that sort of, top 3 category, or comfortably in that top 3 category, because I just don't know if we'd have had that level of confidence before probably last Saturday when he beat Tsitsipas in straight sets. But, there's an argument for various different players. As you said, it's quite open with no Rafa there. But for all the variables, and Carlos is pretty consistent despite his age. So I'm going with Carlos. But, yeah, of course, if Novak wins his 23rd Grand Slam, that's hardly a falling off the chair shocking moment.
So Carlos, your final pick. Novak, my final pick. Okay, we'll close up shop there. Thanks very much for joining us. This has been our French Open men's draw preview. John, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
And we'll catch you next time on the On the Line Tennis Podcast. Cheers.